I thought I was just buying reliable transportation. I had no idea I was about to uncover something that would change 3 lives forever and force me to make a choice that would define who I really was. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Jessica Martinez, and I'm a 28-year-old elementary school teacher living in Cedar Falls, Iowa. I've always been the practical one in my family, the one who researches everything twice before making any decision. When my old Honda finally gave up after 180,000 miles, I knew I needed something dependable but affordable on a teacher's salary. That's how I found myself at Riverside Auto Sales on a humid Thursday afternoon in late September, wearing my best professional outfit and carrying a folder full of financing pre-approvals. The dealership sat on the edge of town, a sprawling lot filled with cars that had seen better days but still promised hope to buyers like me. The smell of motor oil and summer heat hung in the air as I walked between rows of vehicles, each one sporting a bright yellow price sticker and the promise of a fresh start. I had done my homework, researching reliable models that wouldn't break my budget, and I had narrowed my search down to a few specific makes and years. That's when I saw her. A 2018 silver Toyota Camry sitting quietly in the third row, almost as if she was waiting for me. The paint was immaculate, the interior looked barely used, and the mileage was surprisingly low for a 5-year-old car. I ran my hand along the smooth hood, peered through the windows at the pristine dashboard, and felt that flutter of excitement you get when you know you found something special. The salesman, a middle-aged man named Frank with kind eyes and a gentle manner, appeared beside me within minutes. He had been watching me circle the car twice, taking notes on my phone and checking under the hood with the determination of someone who had learned to be cautious about major purchases. Frank told me the car had been traded in just 2 weeks earlier by an elderly gentleman who could no longer drive due to health issues. The previous owner had maintained it meticulously, Frank explained, and they had barely gotten it detailed and ready for sale. The test drive was flawless. The engine purred quietly, the air conditioning worked perfectly, and the car handled like a dream. Every button responded, every system functioned exactly as it should. The radio had been preset to classical music stations, the seats were adjusted for someone much taller than me, and there was a faint scent of pine air freshener that made the interior feel clean and cared for. I could picture myself driving to work each morning, taking weekend trips to visit my sister in Des Moines, finally having reliable transportation that wouldn't leave me stranded in school parking lots. The paperwork took longer than the test drive. Frank was thorough, explaining every document and making sure I understood the warranty details. The financing came through exactly as expected, and by 5:30 that evening, I was holding keys to my first major purchase as an independent adult. I felt a surge of pride as I signed the final papers, knowing I had worked hard and saved carefully to reach this moment. This wasn't just a car purchase. It was proof that I could take care of myself, make smart financial decisions, and invest in my future. I drove home slowly that first evening, getting used to the feel of the steering wheel and the height of the seat. The sun was setting behind me, casting long shadows across the cornfields that stretched endlessly on both sides of the highway. For the first time in months, I felt genuinely optimistic about the future. My old car had been causing me stress for so long, breaking down at inconvenient moments and requiring expensive repairs that ate into my already tight budget. Now I had something dependable, something that would carry me safely to work and back home again. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The next few days passed in a blur of small adjustments and discoveries. I programmed my own radio stations, adjusted the mirrors to my height, and slowly made the car feel like mine. I drove to school each morning with a smile, no longer worried about whether I would make it home that afternoon. My colleagues noticed my improved mood, and I found myself volunteering to drive for group lunches and after-school events. The car represented more than transportation. It represented freedom and independence. It was exactly 1 week after the purchase when I decided to really explore all the car's features and storage spaces. I had been so focused on the basics, the engine and transmission and obvious mechanical elements, that I hadn't thoroughly investigated every compartment and pocket. On that Saturday morning, armed with cleaning supplies and the intention of making the car completely mine, I began a detailed inspection of every surface and space. The glove compartment held the usual collection of items: the owner's manual, registration documents, and a small packet of tissues. The center console contained nothing but a few coins and a charging cable that didn't fit my phone. I cleaned the cup holders, vacuumed the floor mats, and wiped down every surface with care. Everything felt routine and normal until I decided to check the storage pocket behind the driver's seat. My fingers brushed against something unexpected as I reached into the mesh pocket. Something that felt like paper, but thicker than the usual collection of receipts or parking stubs. I pulled out a manila envelope, unsealed and slightly worn, as if it had been handled frequently. The envelope was addressed to someone named Robert Chen, with an address I didn't recognize, but there was no postmark or return address. Inside, I could see the edge of what looked like photographs. I hesitated for a moment, feeling like I was invading someone's privacy, but curiosity won over courtesy. Frank had assured me that the car had been thoroughly cleaned and inspected before sale, so anything left behind was presumably abandoned or forgotten. I opened the envelope carefully and pulled out a stack of perhaps 20 photographs, all printed on regular photo paper and slightly faded as if they were several years old. The first few images seemed innocent enough. Pictures of a young woman with long dark hair, laughing at what appeared to be a restaurant, holding a wine glass and looking genuinely happy. She was beautiful, in an understated way, with warm eyes and a smile that reached every corner of her face. The photos had been taken candidly, capturing natural moments of joy and relaxation. I flipped through several more images of the same woman in different settings, walking through a park, sitting on a porch swing, cooking in a kitchen that looked nothing like the sterile spaces you see in magazines. But as I continued through the stack, the photographs became more unsettling. The woman was clearly unaware she was being photographed in these later images. They had been taken from a distance, through windows, from behind trees, from across parking lots. The angles were awkward and secretive, the kind of shots that made my skin crawl as I realized what I was looking at. These weren't loving photos taken by a boyfriend or husband. These were surveillance photos taken by someone who had been following this woman without her knowledge. My hands began to shake as I reached the final photographs in the stack. The woman was getting into a car outside what looked like an apartment complex, the license plate clearly visible in the background. She was carrying grocery bags, completely unaware that someone was documenting her movements. The timestamp on the back of one photo showed a date from just 3 months earlier, which meant this wasn't some old collection of forgotten memories. This was recent, active, and deeply disturbing. I sat in my driver's seat, staring at the envelope and its contents, feeling my heart rate accelerate as the full implications settled in. The previous owner of my car, the elderly gentleman that Frank had described as meticulously careful, had been stalking this woman. These photos represented hours of surveillance, careful planning, and behavior that was undoubtedly illegal and terrifying for the victim. The woman in the photos had no idea that someone had been watching her, following her, documenting her daily routines with the precision of a predator. I thought about calling my sister first, then my best friend, seeking advice about what to do with this disturbing discovery. But deep down, I already knew there was only one right choice. This woman, whoever she was, deserved to know that someone had been stalking her. The police needed to be informed about the behavior, and the photos needed to be turned over as evidence. I couldn't pretend I had never found them, couldn't ignore what was clearly a serious crime, and couldn't live with myself if something happened to this woman while I stayed silent. The drive to the police station felt endless, even though it was only 15 minutes from my apartment. I kept the envelope on the passenger seat, occasionally glancing over at it as if it might disappear or reveal itself to be something innocent that I had misunderstood. But I knew what I had seen, and I knew it was wrong. The photos told a story of obsession and violation that made me feel sick to my stomach. Detective Sarah Brooks was assigned to my case when I walked into the Cedar Falls Police Department that Saturday afternoon. She was a woman in her early 40s with short auburn hair and a no-nonsense demeanor that immediately put me at ease. I explained how I had purchased the car, discovered the envelope, and realized what the photographs represented. Detective Brooks examined each image carefully, taking notes and asking detailed questions about the car purchase and the previous owner. The woman in the photographs was named Michelle Chen, Detective Brooks told me after running the license plate through their system. She was a 26-year-old graphic designer who lived alone in the apartment complex shown in the surveillance photos. The previous owner of my car, Robert Chen, was Michelle's estranged uncle who had been making unwanted contact with her for several years. Michelle had filed restraining orders and harassment complaints, but had never been able to prove that Robert was actually following her or taking photographs. Detective Brooks explained that Michelle had been living in fear for months, constantly looking over her shoulder and changing her routines because she felt like someone was watching her. She had installed security cameras at her apartment, varied her schedule, and even considered moving to another city, but had never been able to confirm her suspicions or provide evidence that would lead to an arrest. The photographs I had discovered were exactly the proof law enforcement needed to take action against Robert Chen. The investigation that followed revealed the extent of Robert's obsession with his niece. When police searched his home with a warrant, they found additional photographs, detailed notes about Michelle's schedule, and evidence that he had been planning to escalate his behavior. The restraining order Michelle had obtained months earlier had been violated repeatedly, but without proof. She had felt helpless and alone. My accidental discovery had potentially saved her from a dangerous situation that could have become much worse. I met Michelle for the first time 3 weeks later, when Detective Brooks arranged a meeting so she could thank me personally for coming forward with the evidence. She was even more beautiful in person than in the photographs, but what struck me most was the relief visible in her eyes. For the first time in months, she told me, she could sleep through the night without worrying about who might be watching her. She could go grocery shopping, meet friends for dinner, and live her life without constantly checking over her shoulder. Michelle explained that Robert had been estranged from their family for years due to his increasingly erratic behavior and inappropriate comments about women. She had tried to maintain a relationship with him out of family obligation, but his attention had become uncomfortably intense after she graduated from college and moved to Cedar Falls for her first job. What had started as overly frequent phone calls and unexpected visits had escalated into the stalking behavior that I had uncovered. Robert Chen was arrested and charged with stalking, harassment, and violating a restraining order. The photographs I had discovered provided clear evidence of his behavior, and he eventually pleaded guilty to avoid a trial. He was sentenced to 2 years in prison and permanent restraining orders that prohibited him from any contact with Michelle. The case was closed, but the impact on both Michelle's life and mine was just beginning. During our first meeting, Michelle thanked me repeatedly for having the courage to come forward, instead of simply throwing the photographs away and pretending I had never seen them. She told me that many people would have chosen to avoid getting involved, to protect themselves from the complications and potential danger of interfering in someone else's problem. But I had chosen to do the right thing, even though it meant hours of police interviews, court appearances, and the unsettling knowledge that I had unknowingly purchased a vehicle used in the commission of a crime. What I hadn't expected was how much Michelle and I would connect during that first conversation. Beyond the circumstances that had brought us together, we discovered we had similar interests, shared values, and an easy rapport that made talking feel natural and comfortable. She was intelligent, funny, and remarkably resilient considering what she had endured. I was drawn to her strength and her ability to find hope and humor even after months of living in fear. We began meeting for coffee occasionally, then dinner, then weekend activities that had nothing to do with the legal case that had brought us together. Michelle introduced me to art galleries and hiking trails I had never explored. I shared my love of cooking and my knowledge of the best local restaurants that most tourists never discovered. Slowly, carefully, we built a friendship that was based on mutual respect and genuine affection, rather than the dramatic circumstances of our first meeting. The more time I spent with Michelle, the more I understood the depth of trauma that Robert's stalking had caused. She had been robbed of her sense of safety and privacy in ways that were difficult for someone who had never experienced it to fully comprehend. Simple activities like going to the mailbox or taking out the trash had become sources of anxiety. She had changed her phone number, altered her commute to work, and avoided places she had once enjoyed because she never knew if Robert might be watching. Recovery was a slow process that required patience, therapy, and the gradual rebuilding of confidence in her own judgment and safety. Michelle worked with a counselor who specialized in stalking victims, learning techniques for managing anxiety and reclaiming control over her daily life. I supported her however I could, offering rides when she didn't want to walk alone, staying on the phone during evening grocery trips, and simply providing the companionship of someone who understood what she had been through. As months passed and Michelle began to heal from the trauma of being stalked, our friendship deepened into something more meaningful than either of us had anticipated. We had been thrown together by circumstances beyond our control, but we chose to stay together because of the connection we had discovered. The crisis had revealed something about both of our characters that we might never have learned under normal circumstances. I had shown courage and integrity by coming forward with the evidence. Michelle had demonstrated remarkable resilience and grace under pressure. 1 year after I had purchased the car and discovered the photographs, Michelle and I were sharing an apartment and planning a future together. The vehicle that had once been a tool of surveillance and fear had become the means through which two people found each other and built something beautiful from a frightening situation. We had turned a story of victimization into a story of empowerment, connection, and hope. The irony wasn't lost on either of us that Robert's criminal behavior had ultimately brought together two people who might never have met otherwise. His attempt to control and terrorize Michelle had backfired completely, resulting in his imprisonment and her finding both justice and love. The photographs that were meant to document his obsession became the evidence that freed her from fear and introduced her to someone who would cherish and protect her. We still drive that silver Toyota Camry, though it holds completely different associations now than it did during those first terrifying weeks. Instead of representing secrets and danger, it represents the moment when doing the right thing led to unexpected blessings. Every time we get in the car together, we're reminded that sometimes the most important decisions are the ones that feel scary in the moment, but prove to be exactly right in the long term. The experience taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act, despite being afraid. I was terrified when I walked into that police station, unsure of what I was getting myself into and worried about becoming involved in someone else's dangerous situation. But I knew I couldn't live with myself if I stayed silent while someone was being victimized. That choice changed everything, not just for Michelle but for me as well. Looking back now, I realized that walking into the Cedar Falls Police Department that Saturday afternoon was the moment my life split into two distinct chapters. There was Jessica before the photographs, and Jessica after. The woman who had worried about car payments and lesson plans suddenly found herself at the center of something much larger and more frightening than anything she had ever imagined. Detective Brooks led me to a small interview room that smelled like stale coffee and industrial disinfectant. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in a harsh white glow that made the manila envelope on the table between us look even more ominous than it had in my car. She spread the photographs out carefully, organizing them chronologically, and I watched as the story of Robert Chen's obsession unfolded in front of us like scenes from a disturbing movie. The detective's questions were thorough and methodical. She wanted to know exactly where I had found the envelope, whether I had touched anything else in the car, if Frank at the dealership had mentioned anything unusual about the previous owner. I answered everything as completely as I could, but I felt like I was floating outside my own body, watching someone else navigate this surreal situation. This wasn't supposed to be my life. I was supposed to be home grading papers and planning Monday's math lesson, not sitting in a police station providing evidence of a stalking case. Detective Brooks explained that cases like this were more common than most people realized, but they were also among the most difficult to prosecute, because stalkers were often careful to avoid direct confrontation or obvious crimes. They operated in shadows and gray areas, making their victims feel crazy or paranoid while maintaining plausible deniability about their actions. The photographs I had discovered were unusual because they provided clear, undeniable evidence of surveillance and invasion of privacy. When Detective Brooks told me that the woman in the photographs was Michelle Chen, Robert's niece, my stomach dropped. The idea that a family member could terrorize someone this way felt particularly twisted and heartbreaking. Michelle had trusted Robert enough to let him into her life, to share family gatherings and personal information, only to have that trust violated in the most invasive way possible. The betrayal was almost as disturbing as the stalking itself. The detective asked if I would be willing to testify if the case went to trial, and I agreed without hesitation, despite the fear that was growing in my chest. What if Robert had friends or family members who would retaliate against me for coming forward? What if he somehow discovered my identity and decided to target me next? The rational part of my mind knew that staying silent wasn't an option, but the frightened part wondered if I was making myself vulnerable to a dangerous person who had already proven he was willing to violate boundaries and break laws. Detective Brooks assured me that my information would be kept confidential as much as possible during the investigation, but she was honest about the fact that I would likely need to appear in court if Robert chose to fight the charges. She gave me her direct phone number and told me to call immediately if I noticed anything unusual around my apartment or workplace. The conversation made the danger feel real and immediate, in a way that sitting in my car looking at photographs hadn't quite accomplished. I drove home that evening, feeling like the world had shifted slightly off its axis. The familiar streets of Cedar Falls looked the same, but I found myself checking my rearview mirror more frequently and paying attention to cars that might be following me. Was this how Michelle had felt for months? This constant low-level anxiety about who might be watching and what their intentions might be. The thought made me feel sick with empathy for what she had endured alone. My apartment felt different that night, too. I locked the door carefully and checked the windows before settling in to try to process what had happened. The evening news was playing on television, stories about local politics and weather forecasts that seemed trivial compared to what I had just experienced. I kept thinking about Michelle, wondering where she was at that moment, and whether she knew that someone had finally found proof of what she had been experiencing. Sleep was impossible. Every small sound in the building made me alert and anxious. The neighbor's television, footsteps in the hallway, the ice maker in my refrigerator cycling on, all became potential threats in my heightened state of awareness. I found myself getting up repeatedly to check the locks and peer through the blinds at the parking lot outside. This was just one night of knowing that a stalker existed in my community, and I was already exhausted by the vigilance required. Michelle had been living this way for months. Sunday morning brought a phone call from Detective Brooks with an update that both relieved and terrified me. Michelle had been contacted and informed about the discovery of the photographs. Her reaction had been a mixture of vindication and fear. Vindication, because she finally had proof that her instincts had been correct, and she wasn't imagining the surveillance she had suspected. Fear, because the photographs confirmed that Robert's behavior had been even more invasive and extensive than she had realized. The detective told me that Michelle wanted to meet me, to thank me personally for coming forward with the evidence. The request felt overwhelming at first. I had spent the weekend thinking about Michelle as an abstract victim, someone I was helping from a distance. The idea of meeting her face-to-face made the situation feel more real and personal than I was prepared for. But I also understood her need to connect with the person who had potentially saved her from escalating danger. We arranged to meet at a coffee shop downtown 3 days later, on Wednesday evening after I finished my classes. Detective Brooks would be there as well, partly for security, and partly to answer any questions that might arise about the ongoing investigation. I spent the intervening days alternating between nervousness about the meeting and anger at Robert Chen for putting both Michelle and me in this position. I hadn't asked to become involved in someone else's trauma, but now I was responsible for following through on the commitment I had made. The coffee shop Detective Brooks had chosen was busy enough to provide some anonymity but quiet enough for conversation. I arrived early and chose a table near the back, positioning myself so I could see the entrance while keeping my back to the wall. I was surprised by how naturally these precautionary behaviors came to me, as if some primitive part of my brain had activated survival instincts I didn't know I possessed. Michelle arrived exactly on time, followed by Detective Brooks a few minutes later. I recognized her immediately from the photographs, but seeing her in person was still startling. She was smaller than I had expected, more delicate, and there were shadows under her eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights and too much stress. But there was also a strength in the way she carried herself, a determination that suggested she refused to be defined by what had happened to her. Our conversations started awkwardly, with both of us unsure how to navigate the strange circumstances that had brought us together. How do you thank someone for accidentally discovering evidence of your victimization? How do you respond when a stranger has potentially saved you from danger you didn't even fully realize you were in? We fumbled through the initial pleasantries while Detective Brooks watched quietly, ready to intervene if the discussion became too emotional or overwhelming. But gradually, as we talked, I began to see Michelle as more than just a victim in a criminal case. She was funny and intelligent, with a dry sense of humor that emerged despite the seriousness of our situation. She told me about her work as a graphic designer, her love of hiking and photography, her plans to adopt a rescue dog once she felt safe enough to have a regular walking schedule again. She was a complete person, with interests and dreams that had nothing to do with her uncle's criminal behavior. Michelle explained that Robert had been part of her extended family for as long as she could remember, but he had always been the relative that everyone whispered about and avoided inviting to gatherings. He had never married, had difficulty maintaining employment, and made inappropriate comments about women that made family dinners uncomfortable. Michelle's parents had tried to maintain a relationship with him out of obligation, but they had gradually distanced themselves as his behavior became more erratic and concerning. The stalking had started about 2 years earlier, shortly after Michelle graduated from college and moved to Cedar Falls for her first job. Robert had helped her move, insisting on carrying boxes and learning the layout of her apartment in a way that seemed helpful at the time but felt sinister in retrospect. He had begun calling frequently, showing up uninvited at her workplace and making comments about her appearance and lifestyle that crossed appropriate boundaries. Michelle had tried to address the behavior directly at first, telling Robert that his attention made her uncomfortable and asking him to respect her privacy. But her requests had only seemed to escalate his interest, as if her discomfort was somehow encouraging rather than discouraging his behavior. He had become more creative in his approaches, finding excuses to be in her neighborhood and gathering information about her routines from mutual family members who didn't realize they were enabling his obsession. The restraining order had been a last resort after Robert showed up at her apartment late one night, claiming he was concerned about her safety and demanding to inspect her locks and windows. Michelle had called the police that night, but Robert had left before they arrived, and there was no proof that he had been there beyond her word against his. The legal process had been frustrating and humiliating, requiring Michelle to document and relive every uncomfortable interaction, while Robert portrayed himself as a concerned family member who was being unfairly persecuted. Even with the restraining order in place, Michelle had continued to feel watched and followed, but she had no concrete evidence to support her fears. Family members accused her of being paranoid and suggested that she was letting the situation affect her mental health in unhealthy ways. The isolation and self-doubt had been almost as damaging as the stalking itself, making Michelle question her own perceptions and wonder if she was overreacting to innocent coincidences. The photographs I had discovered validated everything Michelle had suspected and feared. They proved that her instincts had been accurate, that Robert had indeed been watching her home and documenting her movements with the systematic patience of a predator. More importantly, they provided the concrete evidence that law enforcement needed to take action and ensure that Robert would face real consequences for his behavior. Detective Brooks explained that the investigation was moving quickly now that they had physical evidence to work with. Robert had been arrested the previous day during a search of his residence, which had revealed additional photographs, detailed notes about Michelle's schedule, and evidence that he had been planning to escalate his surveillance. The search had also uncovered items that belonged to Michelle, things that had gone missing from her apartment and workplace over the past several months. The relief in Michelle's voice when she heard about Robert's arrest was palpable, but it was tempered by the realization that she would need to testify about her experiences during his trial. She would have to relive the fear and violation in front of strangers, describe intimate details of how the stalking had affected her daily life, and face Robert in a courtroom setting that would give him one final opportunity to intimidate her with his presence. I found myself volunteering to support Michelle through the legal process, offering to attend court dates with her and help her prepare for testimony. The offer surprised me as much as it did her. I had never considered myself particularly brave or activist-minded, But something about Michelle's situation called to a part of me that couldn't stand by and watch someone suffer alone. Maybe it was my teacher's instinct to protect and nurture. Or maybe it was simply recognition that doing the right thing sometimes requires more than a single moment of courage. Michelle accepted my offer gratefully, and we exchanged phone numbers with the understanding that we would stay in contact throughout the legal proceedings. Detective Brooks seemed pleased by our mutual support system, explaining that victims often struggled with the court process when they felt isolated and vulnerable. Having an advocate who understood the case and could provide emotional support often made the difference between successful prosecution and cases that fell apart due to victim reluctance to testify. As we prepared to leave the coffee shop that evening, Michelle asked if I regretted buying the car that had led to this discovery. The question caught me off guard because I hadn't really considered whether I wished I had never found the photographs. On one hand, my life had become significantly more complicated and stressful since that Saturday morning, when I had decided to thoroughly clean my new car. On the other hand, a dangerous criminal was now in custody instead of continuing to terrorize an innocent woman. I realized that I didn't regret the discovery at all. The photographs had been hidden in my car whether I found them or not. Robert's behavior had been ongoing whether I knew about it or not. Michelle's fear had been real whether I validated it or not. The only thing my discovery had changed was the outcome. Instead of escalating into something potentially violent, the situation was being resolved through proper legal channels with real consequences for the perpetrator. That night I drove home feeling emotionally drained, but somehow more grounded than I had felt since the whole ordeal began. Meeting Michelle had transformed her from an abstract victim into a real person whose strength and resilience inspired me. I understood now that my role in this situation wasn't finished just because I had turned over the evidence to police. Michelle needed ongoing support, and I found myself genuinely wanting to provide it. The next few weeks established a routine of regular contact between Michelle and me as the legal case progressed. We talked on the phone several times a week, sharing updates about the investigation and gradually learning more about each other's lives beyond the circumstances that had brought us together. Michelle was working with a therapist who specialized in stalking victims, learning techniques for managing the anxiety and hypervigilance that had become second nature during the months of surveillance. I found myself researching stalking laws and victim advocacy resources, wanting to understand Michelle's experience more completely and be as helpful as possible during her recovery process. The statistics were sobering. Most stalking cases never resulted in arrests because of the difficulty in gathering evidence. Many victims were forced to uproot their entire lives, changing jobs and moving to different cities to escape persistent stalkers who faced no meaningful consequences for their behavior. Michelle had been lucky in some ways, unlucky in others. Lucky because Robert's carelessness in leaving evidence in his traded car had provided law enforcement with the proof they needed. Unlucky because family dynamics had made it difficult for her to get support and validation when the stalking first began. Her parents still struggled to accept that Robert, whatever his flaws, was capable of the systematic invasion of privacy that the photographs revealed. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks after Robert's arrest, and Michelle asked if I would accompany her to provide moral support. I agreed immediately, taking a personal day from school and spending the morning helping Michelle prepare for what would be her first face-to-face encounter with Robert since his arrest. She was nervous but determined, having worked with her therapist to develop coping strategies for managing her anxiety during the court appearance. The courthouse was exactly what I expected from television shows and movies, all marble floors and high ceilings, and the peculiar mixture of grandeur and bureaucracy that characterizes government buildings. Michelle and I sat together in the gallery while lawyers argued about evidence and procedure, watching Robert Chen in person for the first time since this whole ordeal began. He was smaller than I had imagined, a thin man in his 50s with graying hair and nervous energy that made him fidget constantly with his hands and clothing. He looked more pathetic than dangerous, which somehow made his behavior seem even more disturbing. This ordinary-looking person had systematically terrorized his own niece for months, documenting her private life with the patience and planning of someone completely disconnected from normal human empathy. Robert's defense attorney argued that the photographs were circumstantial evidence of someone who was genuinely concerned about his niece's safety, rather than proof of criminal stalking. He painted Robert as a lonely, socially awkward man who had misunderstood appropriate boundaries rather than deliberately violating them. The argument felt insulting and ridiculous given the systematic nature of the surveillance, but I could see how it might create reasonable doubt if the prosecution wasn't careful about how they presented their case. Michelle testified with quiet dignity about the fear and anxiety that had dominated her life for months, describing specific incidents when she had felt watched or followed but had no proof to offer anyone. Her voice remained steady even when describing the most frightening encounters, and I felt a surge of admiration for her courage in facing Robert across the courtroom while recounting how his behavior had affected her daily life. When my turn came to testify about discovering the photographs, I focused on the facts of how and where I had found them, avoiding speculation about Robert's motivations or the impact on Michelle. The defense attorney tried to suggest that I might have misunderstood innocent family photos, but the prosecution's presentation of the images made it clear that these were surveillance photos taken without the subject's knowledge or consent. The judge ruled that there was sufficient evidence to proceed to trial, and Robert was remanded to custody pending the court date that was scheduled for 3 months later. Michelle cried quietly as we left the courthouse, but they were tears of relief rather than sadness. For the first time since the stalking began, she felt like the legal system was taking her seriously and protecting her from further victimization. That evening, Michelle and I went to dinner to decompress from the stress of the court appearance. The conversation drifted away from legal proceedings and toward more personal topics, as we discovered shared interests in cooking, traveling, and outdoor activities. I learned that Michelle had been an art major in college before switching to graphic design for practical reasons, and she still painted in her spare time when anxiety didn't make it impossible to concentrate on creative projects. Michelle told me that she had been planning to move to a different city before Robert's arrest, feeling like Cedar Falls would never feel safe as long as he was free to continue his surveillance. Now she was reconsidering that decision, thinking about staying and reclaiming the life that his behavior had disrupted. She had missed hiking trails she loved, restaurants she enjoyed, and the sense of community she had been building before fear made her withdraw from social activities. I found myself encouraging Michelle to stay, not just because of the legal case, but because I genuinely enjoyed her company and wanted to continue the friendship that was developing between us. She brought a different perspective to conversations about books, movies, and current events, and I appreciated her dry sense of humor and thoughtful approach to complex issues. The traumatic circumstances that had brought us together were beginning to fade into background as we discovered a natural compatibility that had nothing to do with stalking or criminal investigations. As winter approached and the trial date grew closer, Michelle and I settled into a routine of regular contact that felt increasingly natural and important to both of us. We met for coffee twice a week, attended cultural events around town, and gradually built the kind of friendship that I had been missing since moving to Cedar Falls for my teaching job. Michelle introduced me to art galleries and hiking trails I had never explored, while I shared my knowledge of the best local restaurants and seasonal festivals. The trial itself was scheduled for early December, and both Michelle and I were dreading the intensive court proceedings that would force us to relive the most stressful period of our lives. But we were also looking forward to the resolution that would finally close this chapter and allow Michelle to move forward without the constant threat of Robert's surveillance hanging over her daily activities. What neither of us anticipated was how much our friendship would deepen during the months of preparation and waiting, or how significantly my own life would change as a result of choosing to get involved in someone else's crisis. I had thought I was just doing the right thing by reporting criminal evidence to police. I had no idea I was beginning a relationship that would transform both of our futures in ways we couldn't have imagined that first awkward evening in the coffee shop downtown. The trial began on a bitter December morning when frost covered the courthouse steps, and the wind cut through my heaviest coat like it was made of paper. Michelle and I arrived early, both of us too nervous to eat breakfast and running on coffee and determination. The media attention had been minimal, which was exactly what Michelle wanted. This wasn't the kind of case that generated headlines, but it was the kind that could quietly destroy someone's life if the justice system failed to protect victims of persistent harassment. Robert's defense team had spent the intervening months trying to create a narrative of misunderstanding and family concern gone wrong. They painted him as an eccentric but harmless uncle who had difficulty reading social cues, someone whose awkward attempts at protection had been misinterpreted as threatening behavior. The strategy was clever because it acknowledged Robert's unusual conduct while reframing it as bumbling kindness rather than criminal stalking. The prosecution countered with testimony from Michelle's therapist about the documented psychological impact of sustained surveillance, expert witnesses on stalking behavior patterns, and the systematic nature of the photographic evidence I had discovered. They methodically built a case that Robert's actions were deliberate, calculated, and escalating in ways that suggested potential violence if left unchecked. I testified again during the formal trial, this time spending more time explaining exactly how I had found the envelope and describing the photographs in detail for the jury. The defense attorney pressed me about whether I might have been mistaken about the secretive nature of the images, suggesting that they could have been taken with Michelle's knowledge and consent. I explained patiently that the angles, distances, and hidden vantage points made it impossible for the subject to have been aware of the photography. Michelle's testimony was the most difficult part of the trial for both of us. She spent nearly 2 full days on the witness stand, describing not just the specific incidents of stalking, but the cumulative effect on her mental health, career, and personal relationships. She explained how Robert's behavior had forced her to change her routines, avoid places she enjoyed, and live in constant fear of who might be watching her from shadows and parked cars. The defense attorney's cross-examination was brutal, designed to make Michelle appear paranoid and unstable rather than genuinely victimized. He questioned whether she had accurately remembered dates and times, suggested that her fear was disproportionate to Robert's actual behavior, and implied that family loyalty should have motivated her to address the situation privately rather than involving law enforcement. Michelle handled the aggressive questioning with remarkable composure, but I could see the toll it was taking on her confidence and emotional stability. Robert himself never testified, which surprised me until Detective Brooks explained that his attorney was protecting him from questions about other potential victims and additional evidence that hadn't been introduced during the trial. The prosecution had focused narrowly on the case against Michelle to avoid complications, but there were hints that Robert's behavior might have extended beyond stalking his niece. His silence in court felt ominous rather than strategic. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all charges related to stalking, harassment, and violating the restraining order. Michelle collapsed into tears when the verdict was read, but they were tears of relief and vindication rather than sadness. For the first time in nearly 2 years, she knew that Robert would face real consequences for his behavior and that she could begin rebuilding her life without fear of continued surveillance. Robert's sentencing hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later, and Michelle asked if I would write a victim impact statement describing how his actions had affected not just her but also innocent bystanders like me, who had become inadvertently involved in his criminal behavior. I spent several days crafting a letter that explained how discovering the photographs had changed my sense of safety in my own community and made me realize how easily anyone could become a target of someone else's obsession. The judge sentenced Robert to 3 years in prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation with permanent restraining orders prohibiting any contact with Michelle or her immediate family. The sentence was longer than we had expected, reflecting the judge's concern about the systematic nature of the stalking and the potential for escalation if Robert's behavior had continued unchecked. Michelle and I held hands as the sentence was pronounced, both of us finally able to believe that this chapter was truly closed. The weeks following the sentencing were strangely anticlimactic after months of intense legal proceedings and emotional preparation. Michelle and I found ourselves with time and energy that had been consumed by court dates and testimony preparation, suddenly free to focus on other aspects of our lives. But instead of drifting apart now that the crisis was over, we discovered that our friendship had developed its own momentum, independent of the circumstances that had created it. Michelle began making plans to reclaim activities and places that Robert's stalking had forced her to abandon. She started hiking again on trails she had avoided for months, returned to her favorite coffee shop that offered outdoor seating where she had felt too exposed, and resumed evening art classes at the community center, where she had worried about walking to her car alone after dark. Each recovered piece of her normal life felt like a small victory over the fear that had controlled her for so long. I found myself becoming Michelle's enthusiastic companion for many of these reclamation activities. I had never been much of a hiker before meeting her, but she introduced me to beautiful trails throughout central Iowa that I had never known existed. We spent weekend mornings exploring state parks and nature preserves, talking about everything except stalking and criminal trials, gradually building a relationship based on shared interests rather than shared trauma. Michelle's art became another bridge between us, as she slowly regained the ability to concentrate on creative projects without anxiety interrupting her focus. She had been working primarily in digital design for her job, but her personal artwork was watercolor paintings of landscapes and natural scenes that captured the peaceful outdoor spaces where she felt most safe and grounded. I was amazed by her talent and encouraged her to consider showing her work publicly again. Spring arrived early that year, and with it came a sense of renewal and possibility that both Michelle and I embraced eagerly. She had been accepted into a graduate program in art therapy, planning to combine her creative background with her experience as a crime victim to help other people heal from trauma. The program would require her to relocate to Minneapolis for 2 years, a prospect that filled me with unexpected sadness as I realized how much I would miss her daily presence in my life. Michelle's plans to move away for graduate school forced me to confront feelings that I had been avoiding acknowledging, even to myself. Our friendship had become central to my happiness and sense of purpose in ways that went beyond simple companionship. I looked forward to our conversations, felt energized by her enthusiasm for art and nature, and had begun organizing my weekends around activities we could share. The thought of losing her company felt like losing something essential to my own identity. I struggled with whether to tell Michelle how much she meant to me, worried that declaring deeper feelings might complicate our friendship, or make her feel pressured to reciprocate emotions she might not share. Our relationship had begun in such unusual circumstances that I wasn't sure if what we had built together was truly romantic love, or simply the intense bond that develops between people who support each other through crisis. The last thing I wanted was to jeopardize the friendship that had become so important to both of us. The decision was made for me one evening in late April, when Michelle and I were cooking dinner together at her apartment. We had developed a routine of sharing meals several times a week, taking turns introducing each other to favorite recipes and experimenting with new cuisines. Michelle was teaching me to make homemade pasta while I guided her through the process of preparing authentic Mexican dishes my grandmother had taught me years earlier. As we worked side by side in her small kitchen, Michelle suddenly stopped stirring the sauce and turned to face me with an expression I couldn't quite read. She said that she needed to tell me something important before she left for Minneapolis, something she had been thinking about for weeks but hadn't found the courage to express. My heart started racing as I prepared myself for whatever revelation was coming. Michelle told me that meeting me had changed her life in ways that went far beyond the criminal case that had brought us together. She explained that my courage in coming forward with the evidence had not only freed her from Robert's stalking, but had also introduced her to someone who made her feel understood, supported, and genuinely cared for in ways she had never experienced before. She said that she had fallen in love with me gradually, so slowly that she hadn't recognized it until the prospect of separation made the depth of her feelings impossible to ignore. I felt overwhelmed with relief and joy as I realized that Michelle's feelings mirrored my own confusion and uncertainty about the nature of our relationship. I told her that I had been struggling with the same questions about whether what we shared was friendship or something deeper, that I had been afraid to risk our connection by admitting how much I cared about her beyond simple companionship and mutual support through difficult circumstances. We talked until nearly dawn that night, exploring the possibility of building a romantic relationship on the foundation of friendship and shared experience we had already established. Michelle was worried that her trauma history might make intimate relationships more complicated than either of us was prepared to handle. I was concerned that my lack of experience with serious romantic commitment might make me inadequate support for someone who had been through as much as she had endured. But we also recognized that we had already proven our ability to support each other through the most stressful period of either of our lives. We had seen each other frightened, angry, exhausted, and vulnerable, and our care for each other had only deepened through those shared challenges. If we could navigate criminal trials and stalking investigations together, perhaps we could figure out how to build a healthy romantic partnership as well. Michelle decided to defer graduate school for 1 year to give us time to explore our relationship without the pressure of immediate separation. The decision felt simultaneously thrilling and terrifying to both of us, representing a commitment to something neither of us had expected when we first met in that coffee shop downtown. We were choosing each other deliberately this time, not just supporting each other through crisis but actively building something together. The summer we spent as an officially romantic couple was transformative for both of us, in ways that had nothing to do with the dramatic circumstances that had brought us together. We learned each other's daily rhythms and domestic preferences, discovered new shared interests in gardening and local history, and gradually built the kind of intimate partnership that develops when two people choose to intertwine their lives by choice rather than necessity. Michelle's recovery from the trauma of being stalked accelerated once she no longer felt like she was facing the healing process alone. Having a partner who understood exactly what she had been through and who had been present for every step of the legal proceedings provided a sense of security and validation that professional therapy alone couldn't offer. She began sleeping through the night without anxiety dreams, walking alone during daylight hours without constantly checking over her shoulder, and engaging in social activities without fear of who might be watching her. My own life expanded in ways I hadn't anticipated. As Michelle introduced me to communities and activities I had never considered exploring on my own. Through her art connections, I met people who challenged my thinking about creativity, social justice, and the role of artistic expression in processing difficult experiences. Through her hiking and outdoor interests, I developed physical confidence and appreciation for natural beauty that had been missing from my previously sedentary lifestyle focused on indoor academic pursuits. We began making long-term plans together that extended beyond Michelle's deferred graduate program. She applied to art therapy programs in Iowa and surrounding states, looking for options that would allow her to pursue her career goals without requiring us to live apart for extended periods. I investigated opportunities to teach in larger school districts that might offer more professional development and advancement potential than my current position in Cedar Falls. The anniversary of our first meeting approached in September, marking 1 full year since I had discovered those photographs in my car and changed both of our lives forever. Michelle suggested that we celebrate by taking a weekend trip to explore a new hiking destination, something that would mark how far she had come in reclaiming her love of outdoor activities, and how much our relationship had grown beyond its origins in crisis and trauma. We chose a state park in northern Minnesota that neither of us had visited before, packing camping gear and planning several days of hiking trails that ranged from easy lakeside walks to challenging climbs through old-growth forest. The trip represented everything positive that had emerged from the most frightening period of either of our lives. Our love for each other, Michelle's recovery of confidence and joy in previously threatened activities, and our shared commitment to building a future together based on choice rather than circumstance. On our final evening at the campground, as we sat by a small fire watching stars emerge in the clear northern sky, Michelle told me that she had made a decision about graduate school. She had been accepted into an excellent art therapy program at the University of Iowa, less than 2 hours from Cedar Falls, that would allow her to commute rather than relocate. She could pursue her career goals while maintaining the life we were building together, integrating professional growth with personal happiness, rather than choosing one over the other. The news felt like the final piece of a puzzle that had been assembling itself throughout the year since we met. Every major decision point had somehow worked out in ways that allowed us to stay connected and continue growing together. Robert's carelessness in leaving evidence in his traded car had led to his conviction. The trial proceedings had brought Michelle and me closer, rather than driving us apart. The deferral of graduate school had given us time to develop our romantic relationship without pressure. Now the perfect program had emerged that would support Michelle's professional aspirations while preserving our personal partnership. As I looked at Michelle across the campfire that night, I realized that what had started as the most frightening and disruptive experience of my adult life had become the source of everything I valued most about my current existence. The choice to do the right thing by reporting criminal evidence had introduced me to someone who challenged me to be braver, more adventurous, and more emotionally available than I had ever imagined I could become. Michelle reached across the space between our camp chairs and took my hand, her fingers warm and steady in the firelight. She said that she had been thinking about how to thank me for the courage I had shown in coming forward with the photographs, but she had realized that gratitude wasn't the right framework for understanding what had happened between us. Instead of one person helping another, we had helped each other discover capabilities and connections that neither of us had known we possessed. I squeezed her hand and told her that she was right about gratitude being inadequate to describe our relationship, but for different reasons than she had suggested. I wasn't the hero of this story who had rescued her from danger through my moral courage. She was the person who had shown me that doing the right thing could lead to rewards beyond anything I had thought I deserved. She had taught me that love could grow from the strangest circumstances, and that building a life with someone else was not only possible but more fulfilling than anything I had experienced living independently. We stayed up late that night talking about our hopes for the future, our fears about whether we could maintain our happiness through ordinary challenges after proving ourselves capable of handling extraordinary crises together. We made tentative plans for Michelle's graduate school years, discussed the possibility of moving to a larger city where both of our career opportunities might be enhanced, and acknowledged that we still had significant learning to do about sustaining a romantic partnership through normal life rather than dramatic circumstances. But we also recognized that the foundation we had built together was strong enough to support whatever challenges or opportunities lay ahead of us. We had chosen each other deliberately and consistently, through fear and relief, crisis and calm, uncertainty and hope. The silver Toyota Camry that had brought us together now represented not the site of a criminal discovery, but the beginning of the most important relationship either of us had ever experienced. The drive home from Minnesota felt different from any trip I had taken in that car before. Instead of the practical transportation device I had purchased a year earlier, it had become a symbol of how random events could lead to profound connections when people chose to respond with courage and compassion, rather than fear and avoidance. Every mile back toward Cedar Falls brought us closer to the life we were building together, a life that had grown from the most unlikely beginning either of us could have imagined. The decision to combine our lives permanently came gradually, built from hundreds of small choices rather than one dramatic moment of commitment. By the following spring, Michelle and I had been together for nearly 2 years, navigating the ordinary challenges of any couple learning to share space, resources, and daily decisions. We had moved into a larger apartment together when her lease expired, blending our furniture and establishing routines that accommodated both of our work schedules and personal preferences. Michelle excelled in her art therapy program, bringing home stories about clients who were healing from various traumas through creative expression. Her own experience as a crime victim gave her unique insight and credibility with people struggling to reclaim their sense of safety and control after devastating experiences. Watching her transform her own pain into a tool for helping others was both inspiring and humbling, reminding me daily of the strength she had demonstrated throughout our relationship. My teaching career had also evolved during this period as I pursued additional certification in special education and began working with students who had experienced various forms of trauma in their home lives. Michelle's influence had opened my eyes to the ways that adverse experiences could affect learning and behavior, leading me to develop more patient and creative approaches to classroom management and academic support. The skills I was learning at home through our relationship were making me a more effective educator. We had settled into a comfortable rhythm of shared domestic responsibilities, weekend adventures, and individual pursuits that complemented rather than competed with our partnership. Michelle maintained her connections to the art community through gallery openings and group studio sessions, while I had joined a book club and started volunteering with a literacy program for adult learners. Our lives were intertwined but not dependent, connected but not constrained. The conversation that changed everything happened on a quiet Sunday morning in May, while we were having breakfast on the small balcony of our apartment. Michelle had been reading articles about art therapy programs in other states, researching opportunities for specialization and advanced training that might become available after she completed her current degree. I was grading papers and planning the final weeks of the school year, both of us comfortable with the parallel activity and occasional conversation that characterized our weekend mornings. Michelle put down her tablet and looked at me with the expression that I had learned meant she was about to say something important. She told me that she had been offered an incredible opportunity that she hadn't mentioned, because she wasn't sure how to present it without creating pressure or conflict in our relationship. A renowned art therapy institute in Portland, Oregon had invited her to apply for a prestigious fellowship program that would provide 2 years of advanced training with some of the leading practitioners in the field. The fellowship was exactly the kind of opportunity that could transform Michelle's career and establish her as a leader in the field of trauma recovery through artistic expression. The institute worked with veterans, abuse survivors, and people recovering from severe mental illness, exactly the populations Michelle felt most passionate about serving. The program would provide specialized training, research opportunities, and professional connections that would be impossible to replicate anywhere else in the country. The catch, of course, was that the fellowship required full-time residency in Portland for the entire 2-year period. Michelle would need to relocate across the country, immerse herself completely in the intensive program, and essentially put the rest of her life on hold while pursuing this extraordinary professional opportunity. The fellowship included a substantial stipend and housing assistance, but it explicitly discouraged participants from maintaining significant personal commitments that might distract from their studies and clinical work. Michelle explained that she had initially dismissed the opportunity without seriously considering it, because she couldn't imagine leaving our life together in Iowa. But her faculty advisor had encouraged her to reconsider, pointing out that opportunities like this fellowship were extremely rare and might not be available again for many years. The application deadline was only 3 weeks away, barely enough time to prepare the required portfolio and personal statements if she decided to pursue it. I felt my stomach drop as I realized what Michelle was really asking me. She wanted to know if I would support her decision to apply for the fellowship, knowing that acceptance would mean 2 years of separation and uncertainty about our future together. She was essentially asking me to choose between my own happiness and her professional fulfillment, to sacrifice our current stability for the possibility that she might achieve something extraordinary in her field. My initial reaction was entirely selfish. I wanted to tell Michelle that the fellowship wasn't worth risking what we had built together, that her career goals shouldn't take precedence over our relationship, that Portland was too far away for us to maintain any meaningful connection during such an intensive program. I had become so accustomed to sharing my life with her that the prospect of returning to solitary routines felt overwhelming and depressing. But as I looked at Michelle across our small breakfast table, I saw the conflict in her eyes and realized that she was struggling with the same competing loyalties that were tearing at me. She loved our life together and didn't want to jeopardize our relationship, but she also had professional dreams and aspirations that went beyond anything available in Iowa. The fellowship represented a chance to maximize her impact as a healer and advocate, to develop skills that could help countless people recover from trauma more effectively than current standard treatments allowed. I took a deep breath and told Michelle that she should apply for the fellowship regardless of what it might mean for our relationship. I explained that I couldn't live with myself if I became the reason she passed up an opportunity that could transform her ability to help other people heal from experiences similar to what she had endured. Our love for each other had grown from her courage in facing difficult challenges, and I needed to show the same courage in supporting her continued growth, even if it required personal sacrifice from both of us. Michelle started crying as I spoke, torn between gratitude for my support and grief over the possibility that pursuing her dreams might cost her the most important relationship in her life. We held each other on that balcony for a long time, both of us understanding that we were facing the kind of decision that would define not just our individual futures, but also our capacity to love each other unselfishly rather than possessively. The application process consumed the next 3 weeks as Michelle worked frantically to assemble her portfolio, write personal statements, and gather letters of recommendation from faculty and supervisors. I helped however I could, proofreading essays and providing emotional support during moments when the pressure felt overwhelming. We both tried to maintain normal routines and avoid discussing what might happen if she was accepted, but the possibility hung over every conversation and shared activity. Michelle submitted her application on the final day of the deadline, and we celebrated with dinner at our favorite restaurant and a long walk through the park where we had spent so many weekend afternoons during our time together. The acceptance process would take approximately 2 months, giving us the entire summer to either prepare for separation or breathe sighs of relief that the decision had been made for us by someone else's rejection. Those months of waiting were simultaneously the most precious and most anxiety-provoking period of our relationship. We made deliberate efforts to create positive memories together, while also beginning the emotional preparation for possible separation. Michelle researched housing options in Portland and connected with current fellowship participants to learn more about the program's demands and expectations. I investigated opportunities for sabbatical or extended leave that might allow me to spend time in Oregon during school breaks and summer vacations. We also had difficult conversations about what 2 years of separation might mean for our relationship, and whether we were strong enough as a couple to maintain our connection across such distance and time. Michelle worried that asking me to wait for her was unfair and selfish, that I deserved someone who could commit to building a life together without extended interruptions for career advancement. I worried that Michelle might discover during her time in Portland that she preferred the independence and intellectual stimulation of professional focus over the compromises required by serious romantic partnership. The acceptance letter arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in late July while I was at school preparing my classroom for the upcoming academic year. Michelle called me immediately, her voice shaking with excitement and terror as she read the congratulatory message that confirmed her acceptance into the fellowship program. The Institute had been impressed by her portfolio and personal statement, particularly her unique perspective as someone who had experienced trauma personally, while also pursuing professional training and helping others heal from similar experiences. I drove home as quickly as I could manage safely, my emotions cycling rapidly between pride in Michelle's achievement and dread about what her success would cost both of us personally. When I arrived at our apartment, Michelle was sitting on the couch holding the acceptance letter and staring at it as if she couldn't quite believe it was real. She looked up at me with an expression that mixed triumph with sorrow, achievement with loss. We spent that evening celebrating Michelle's accomplishment, while also beginning to plan for the separation that would begin in less than 6 weeks when the fellowship program started. The logistics were overwhelming: canceling her lease on our shared apartment, arranging for storage or disposal of her belongings, coordinating travel and housing arrangements in Portland, and managing the emotional preparation for living apart after more than 2 years of shared daily life. Michelle insisted that I shouldn't uproot my own life in Cedar Falls just because she was relocating for professional reasons. I had tenure-track status at the school district, strong relationships with colleagues and administrators, and stability that had taken years to build. She argued that asking me to sacrifice my career progress for her fellowship would be as unfair as asking her to sacrifice the fellowship for our relationship, that we both needed to pursue our individual goals and trust that our connection was strong enough to survive temporary separation. I understood her logic, but I also felt like I was losing not just my romantic partner but also my closest friend and daily companion. Michelle had become integrated into every aspect of my life in Cedar Falls, from weekend activities to social relationships to household routines. Her absence would leave gaps that couldn't be filled by increased work responsibilities or new hobbies, reminders everywhere of what I was missing while she pursued her dreams thousands of miles away. The final weeks before Michelle's departure passed too quickly and too slowly, filled with practical preparations and emotional conversations that never felt adequate to address the magnitude of what was happening. We had long discussions about communication expectations, visit schedules, and relationship boundaries during the separation period. Michelle was worried that daily phone calls might become burdensome or guilt-inducing when her program demanded total focus. I was worried that too much independence might make her realize she preferred life without the compromises required by serious partnership. We ultimately agreed to communicate regularly but flexibly, checking in with each other at least twice per week but allowing for busy periods when Michelle's clinical work or my teaching responsibilities made frequent contact difficult. We planned for me to visit Portland during winter break, and for Michelle to return to Iowa during any extended breaks in her fellowship schedule. We also acknowledged that 2 years was a long time, and that both of us might change in ways that would affect our relationship, that we needed to be honest with each other about any shifts in feelings or priorities, rather than maintaining connection out of obligation or guilt. The night before Michelle left for Portland, we stayed awake talking until dawn about everything except the separation that was beginning in a few hours. We reminisced about funny moments from our early relationship, made plans for projects we wanted to tackle together when she returned, and shared hopes and fears about our individual futures that had nothing to do with romance or partnership. It felt like we were trying to pack 2 years of conversation into one final evening, to say everything important before distance made communication more difficult. Michelle's flight departed at noon on a Thursday, and I drove her to the airport in the silver Toyota Camry that had brought us together nearly 3 years earlier. The symbolism wasn't lost on either of us as we sat in the departure lane, talking through the car windows while her bags waited on the sidewalk. The vehicle, that had contained evidence of criminal stalking, had become the site of our final conversation before voluntary separation in pursuit of professional growth. I watched Michelle's plane disappear into cloudy skies before driving home to an apartment that felt impossibly empty, despite containing all of my own belongings and familiar furniture. The silence was overwhelming after years of shared space and constant companionship. I realized that I had forgotten how to live alone, how to make decisions without consulting someone else, how to fill evenings and weekends without considering another person's preferences and schedule. The first few weeks of Michelle's absence were the most difficult adjustment period I had experienced since childhood. Everything in our former shared space reminded me of activities we had done together or conversations we had shared. The kitchen felt too large for cooking meals for one person. The living room felt awkward without Michelle's artwork on the walls and her books mixed in with mine on our shared shelves. Even sleeping became challenging as I struggled to adjust to having the entire bed to myself after years of negotiating space and temperature preferences with a partner. Michelle's initial reports from Portland were enthusiastic but exhausting. The fellowship program was even more intensive and demanding than she had anticipated, with 12-hour days split between clinical work, seminars, research projects, and individual therapy for participants who were processing their own trauma histories as part of their professional development. She was learning techniques and theories that excited her intellectually, while also confronting emotional material that left her drained and raw at the end of each day. Our phone conversations during those first weeks were strained and unsatisfying for both of us. Michelle was too tired and emotionally depleted to engage in the kind of detailed sharing that had characterized our relationship, while I felt like I was imposing on her limited free time by expecting connection and support when she was clearly overwhelmed by her new responsibilities. We both began questioning whether maintaining long-distance contact was helping or hindering Michelle's ability to fully commit to her fellowship experience. The breakthrough came about 6 weeks into our separation when Michelle called me crying after a particularly difficult day working with adolescent trauma survivors. She had been trying to appear strong and independent during our conversations, not wanting me to worry about her adjustment or feel guilty about the challenges she was facing. But the emotional intensity of her work was bringing up memories of her own victimization in ways that she hadn't anticipated, and she needed the kind of support that only someone who truly understood her history could provide. I realized during that conversation that I had been making the same mistake, trying to appear fine and adjusted to solitary life, rather than admitting how much I missed Michelle's daily presence and emotional support. We both acknowledged that we had been protecting each other from the full truth of how difficult the separation was for both of us, inadvertently creating distance and artificial independence, rather than maintaining the authentic connection that had always been the foundation of our relationship. From that night forward, our communication became more honest and emotionally intimate than it had been since the early days of our relationship. Michelle shared the details of her challenging clinical work and her own therapy process, while I talked about the loneliness and disorientation of rebuilding solitary routines after years of partnership. We stopped trying to prove that we were handling the separation well and started supporting each other through the genuine difficulties we were both experiencing. The first semester of Michelle's fellowship program passed slowly but productively as we both adjusted to our new normal of connection across distance. Michelle's work was transforming her understanding of trauma recovery and giving her skills that she was eager to eventually bring back to her practice in Iowa. My teaching had also evolved as I threw myself into professional development and curriculum innovation to fill the time and energy that had previously been devoted to relationship maintenance and shared activities. When winter break finally arrived and I flew to Portland for our first extended visit since separation, I was nervous about whether we would still feel compatible after months of independent growth and development. Michelle met me at the airport looking tired but radiant, clearly thriving professionally despite the emotional demands of her program. She had lost weight and gained confidence, carrying herself with the authority of someone who was discovering her true calling and developing expertise in work that felt deeply meaningful. Portland suited Michelle in ways that Iowa never had, providing the cultural richness and professional community that matched her intellectual curiosity and artistic sensibilities. She showed me galleries and coffee shops and hiking trails that had become part of her new routine, introducing me to fellow fellowship participants who shared her passion for innovative approaches to trauma therapy. I could see that she was building a life in Oregon that fulfilled needs and interests that our small-town Iowa existence had never fully addressed. The week we spent together in Portland was wonderful, but also sobering, as I realized how much Michelle was thriving in an environment that offered opportunities unavailable in Cedar Falls. She was conducting research that could influence treatment protocols nationwide, working with populations that desperately needed the specialized skills she was developing, and collaborating with professionals who challenged her thinking in ways that would accelerate her growth as both a therapist and a person. When I returned to Iowa after that visit, I began seriously considering whether my commitment to maintaining our relationship was actually limiting Michelle's potential, rather than supporting it. She had been accepted into one of the most competitive programs in her field, and was excelling in ways that suggested she belonged in a larger professional community than anything available in our home state. Perhaps the most loving thing I could do would be to encourage her to build a permanent life in Portland, rather than expecting her to return to the limitations of Iowa after experiencing what was possible elsewhere. The letter arrived on a cold February morning exactly 18 months into Michelle's fellowship, delivered to my apartment in Cedar Falls with a return address I didn't recognize. Inside was an acceptance notification for a teaching position at Portland Community College, specifically requesting someone with my background in trauma-informed education to develop curriculum for students with adverse childhood experiences. Michelle had submitted my name and portfolio without telling me, convinced that I belonged in a place where my skills could make a broader impact. I stared at the offer letter for hours, reading the details of a job that seemed designed specifically for everything I had learned about trauma, resilience, and healing through my relationship with Michelle. The position offered better compensation than my current role, opportunities for research and curriculum development, and the chance to work with innovative educators who were pioneering approaches to supporting vulnerable student populations. Most importantly, it offered the possibility of reuniting with Michelle while advancing my own career, rather than simply following hers. When I called Michelle that evening, she was waiting anxiously for my reaction to the surprise she had orchestrated. She explained that she had been watching job postings in Portland for months, looking for opportunities that might entice me to relocate, without requiring me to sacrifice my professional goals for our personal relationship. When the community college position appeared, she had contacted the department directly to suggest they consider recruiting someone with my specific qualifications and experience. Michelle admitted that she had been afraid to discuss the possibility with me earlier because she didn't want to pressure me into making a decision based on guilt or obligation rather than genuine professional interest. But her fellowship program was ending in 6 months, and she had been offered a permanent position with the Trauma Recovery Institute that would allow her to continue the work she was passionate about while building a sustainable career in Portland. She wanted me to know that staying in Oregon was her choice, but she hoped it could become our choice together. The decision felt simultaneously obvious and terrifying. Moving to Portland would mean leaving the security and stability I had spent years building in Cedar Falls, relocating to a city where I knew virtually no one except Michelle, and starting over professionally in a new educational system with different standards and expectations. But it would also mean reuniting with the person who had transformed my understanding of courage, compassion, and commitment, while pursuing work that aligned with everything I had learned about making a meaningful difference in people's lives. I accepted the position 3 weeks later, giving my current school district notice that I would be leaving at the end of the academic year. The announcement surprised my colleagues and administrators, who had assumed I was settled permanently in Iowa. Some questioned whether I was making a mistake by prioritizing romance over professional security, warning me about the risks of uprooting my life for a relationship that might not survive the stress of major transitions and new challenges. But I knew something they didn't understand about Michelle and our connection. What we had built together wasn't just romantic attraction or convenient companionship. It was a partnership based on supporting each other's growth, even when that growth required personal sacrifice, choosing each other's happiness even when it complicated our own plans, and trusting that love could survive distance, change, and uncertainty, because it was grounded in genuine compatibility and shared values. The months of preparation for my move to Portland were filled with practical arrangements and emotional processing as I prepared to leave Iowa for the first time in my adult life. Michelle coordinated my job transition and apartment search from Oregon, ensuring that I would have everything I needed to start fresh in a new city. She was as excited about my career opportunity as she was about our reunion, understanding that our relationship would be stronger if we were both pursuing work that challenged and fulfilled us individually. My last day of teaching in Cedar Falls was bittersweet, marked by farewell parties and promises to stay in touch with colleagues who had become genuine friends over the years. Several students and parents thanked me for the patience and understanding I had shown in working with children who were struggling with various forms of trauma, skills I had developed through supporting Michelle's recovery and learning about the long-term effects of victimization and healing. I drove to Portland in the same silver Toyota Camry that had started this entire journey, the vehicle now carrying all my possessions as it transported me toward a completely new chapter of life. The symbolism felt perfect as I crossed state lines and mountain ranges, following highways that led away from everything familiar toward everything uncertain and hopeful. Michelle was waiting for me when I arrived, standing outside the apartment she had found for us to share, radiant with joy and anticipation. Our reunion felt both natural and miraculous, as if we were picking up a conversation that had been paused, rather than starting something entirely new. Michelle had grown even more confident and professionally accomplished during our separation, but she was still the same person who had faced her fears with remarkable courage, and who had taught me that doing the right thing could lead to unexpected rewards. I had also changed during our time apart, becoming more independent and professionally ambitious, but I was still the person who believed that love required action rather than just feeling. Portland embraced us both in ways that Iowa never could have, offering professional opportunities, cultural richness, and a community of people who shared our values about service, creativity, and social justice. Michelle thrived in her permanent position at the Trauma Institute, developing programs that were being replicated in other cities and establishing herself as a leader in her field. I discovered that my new teaching position challenged me intellectually, while allowing me to make a difference in the lives of students who needed exactly the kind of understanding and support I had learned to provide. 6 months after my arrival in Portland, Michelle and I were married in a small ceremony attended by colleagues, friends, and family who had traveled from Iowa to celebrate with us. The wedding felt like the culmination of everything we had learned about commitment, sacrifice, and choosing each other through both crisis and calm. We had proven that our love could survive separation, uncertainty, and major life changes because it was based on genuine compatibility and mutual support rather than just convenience or attraction. The silver Toyota Camry sat in the parking lot during our wedding reception, decorated with flowers and trailing cans in the traditional celebration of newlyweds. But for us, the car represented something deeper than transportation to a honeymoon destination. It symbolized the journey that had brought us together, the courage required to do the right thing even when it was frightening, and the miraculous way that choosing to help someone else had led to discovering the most important relationship of our lives. Years later, when people ask us how we met, Michelle and I tell them the truth about the used car, the discovered photographs, and the criminal case that brought us together. But we also explain that our real story began with the choice to support each other through difficulty, to trust that love could grow from the strangest circumstances, and to believe that sometimes the most important discoveries are the ones we never intended to make. The car that once carried evidence of stalking and fear now carries us to work each morning, to weekend adventures in the Oregon mountains, and to all the ordinary destinations that make up a shared life. Every time we drive somewhere together, we're reminded that courage, compassion, and the willingness to get involved in someone else's crisis can lead to blessings beyond anything we thought we deserved. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.